I'm speaking with Larry Burden, who's a member of Company I and Company B, 20th Maine. Larry, tell us a little bit about your background and your interest in the Civil War and in reenacting.
Well, I got involved in Civil War reenacting about 7 years ago after I retired from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And I saw some Civil War reenactors marching in the St. Andrew's Day or St. Patrick's Day parade in St. Andrews, New Brunswick. I was curious as to why the Americans would come across the border for our little parade. And when I spoke to them, I found out that they were all New Brunswickers, and that they were Company I of the 20th Maine, and that they were reenacting to research and highlight the contributions of New Brunswickers, Nova Scotians, and other Atlantic Canadians in the American Civil War.
Now, you've been heavily involved in researching Canadians from the Maritimes who crossed the border to join American units. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, particularly with the relationship with Maine units?
Sure. A lot of people don't realize that how many people from the Maritime provinces actually fought in the Civil War. People think of Canadians in the Civil War, it's a bit of a misnomer, because Canada as a country did not exist. Canada as a country became a country largely due to the American Civil War. So those who were from Canada, during the American Civil War were actually from Ontario and Quebec. And New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and the other maritime provinces or colonies were separate colonies, in British North America. So they didn't consider themselves Canadians in any way, shape or form. It'd be like, a New Yorker, being called a Texan. Culturally, it just wouldn't fly. They're two different cultures, two different people. So, the migration patterns, of Atlantic Canada go all the way back to the American Revolution, and with, the Loyalists, as we call them, call them Tories, those who remained loyal to the King, tens of thousands of them emigrated to New Brunswick. So many came that they ended up creating the province of New Brunswick, splitting it away from Nova Scotia, and others went to Ontario and Quebec. So there was always this kindred spirit that existed in the first place. And then with the economics of Maine and New Brunswick in particular during the 1830s through the 1850s, was primarily lumber was king, and they chopped down all the trees in both the state of Maine and in the province of New Brunswick, and even led to the so-called Aroostook War. And once all the trees were gone, then people had to follow the trees, and you saw a migration of especially New Brunswickers westward across the top of the northern American states, as far west as Minnesota. And so many of them, when the Civil War broke out, either signed up as adults who had migrated, or their children who were born in New Brunswick and had grown up, with their parents in the states, joined a variety of different groups. But you also had the dichotomy of the Confederacy, and a lot of people don't realize, even people from the Maritimes, that not everybody was pro-union in the Civil War in Atlantic Canada. If you were a coastal community, chances are you were a very staunch supporter of the Confederacy. In places like St. Stephen, St. Andrews, St. John, Halifax, all of these port cities were very, very pro-Confederate. And the more you got inland, the more the church, the Protestant church had an influence, on abolitionism, and so you saw a very strong support for the Union inland, but not so much on the coast. So you got a lot of people on the coast who, actually, fought for the Confederacy, and that had, everything to do with economics, and the free trade with the Confederate States of America that the British North Americans never had with the United States, because they could offload in a major port, but not do any coastal shipping. And so that was put them at an economic disadvantage, whereas with the Confederate States it was free trade and a great opportunity for them. But then Lincoln went and put in the blockade, which led to the blockade runners. So you could see the animosity between those who existed with maritime trade, versus in support of the Union.
Yep.
So it was a very complicated issue. In actuality, when I use the terms, Atlantic Canadians, who fought in the American Civil War, really it comes down to people who were born in Atlantic Canada and then trying to determine how old they were when they signed up as to whether or not they would consider themselves Americans or consider themselves New Brunswickers or whatever the case may be. And that therein lies the challenge. But so many of the statistics that you get regurgitated by historians, have no basis in reality, and they just get regurgitated. So what we do in our little group is we've been digging into the weeds and researching, who these people were and try and find their graves. To that end, over the last 6 years, we've gone from about 65 known Atlantic Canadians to nearly 5,000.
Wow.
And we've found almost 2,000 of their graves as far away as Australia. Understandably so. Most of them are in the United States, because, a lot of them who, came to the States, stayed in the States, probably found a woman and stayed, is probably the main reason, but also economics. So, when Atlantic Canada was forced into joining Canada, and I use that term loosely, but, Canada, was Ontario and Quebec. And before that, the Atlantic provinces, their natural trade route was north and south, up and down the coast. And being forced into Confederation for reasons of fear of annexation, we were forced into an imaginary border that went east to west. And it plunged, the Maritime provinces into the poor cousins of Canada. Yep. Much the same way Maine is the poor cousin of New England. And so, it's kind of, if you took Canada and turned it on its side, you basically have this, the same thing with the United States. Ontario and Quebec being the industrial north, and the Maritimes being the poor, resource-based, cousins to the south. So quite a few different similarities there. So we've been researching this, and some of the research is relatively easy because some states, like Maine, New Hampshire, Minnesota, actually recorded your place of birth. Whereas the larger states like Massachusetts and Ohio and New York, and Pennsylvania, they didn't record your place of birth. It was just your place of residence. So when we're researching that, we can see, okay, this person declared that they were born in New Brunswick or in Nova Scotia or whatever the case may be in those states. And the others, it becomes a real challenge to try and connect the dots through other research and mentioned in different reports or in family folklore or things like that. And then with the Confederacy, it becomes extremely difficult because most of the records were destroyed when Richmond was taken, and there's very few records available. But with that, we've found some really interesting stories of New Brunswickers in particular, who, in one case, in one family from Hampton, New Brunswick, just outside of St. John, the 4 sons fought in the Civil War, 2 of them for the state of Maine, and 2 of them in the Virginia Cavalry. Which wouldn't seem so odd if it was a sort of a border state, like Kansas or Missouri, but this is New Brunswick.
Yeah.
And another really interesting story is the oldest Civil War veteran in New Hampshire. When he died, he was 106 years old. He was from St. Andrews, New Brunswick. He was also the oldest Freemason in New Hampshire, having joined the lodge in St. Stephen, New Brunswick, in Sussex Lodge. He's joined his regiment in New Hampshire when he was 62 years old and fought through the whole war and was wounded at Cedar Creek. And he died at 106 years old, and he was from St. Andrews, New Brunswick. So we're finding tons and tons of really interesting stories, and through our little newsletter, Graves Matter, we're trying to tell the story of these Atlantic Canadians who fought in the American Civil War, because they certainly don't teach about the American Civil War in Canadian schools, or how it could have any possible connection to Canadian history, when in fact, it is a big part of Canadian history.
Thank you.